Good afternoon. Secretary General will brief you on the Resolute Support mission session, and then we'll have time for just a few questions. Secretary General.
Good afternoon. We have just concluded a very constructive meeting with our Resolute Support partners. We were joined by Afghanistan Ministers of Defense, Barami. Together we addressed the security situation in the country, NATO's continued support for Afghanistan and the peace process. NATO allies and partners aren't just maintaining their contributions to our Resolute Support mission, they are increasing their support. Based on our discussions today, I'm confident that we will agree to extend funding to the Afghan security forces to 2024 at next month's summit. A strong signal of our long-term commitment to Afghanistan's security. Significant challenges remain. Insurgents continue to use violence against innocent civilians, but in the face of these challenges, Afghan forces are doing an outstanding job. They have been in the lead for 3 years now, and we see the real progress in their ability to conduct offensive operations, to develop their special forces, air forces, and other capabilities, and deny the Taliban their strategic objectives. Our aim is to strengthen the Afghan security forces so they can create the conditions for a peaceful solution. An Afghan-led and Afghan-owned peace process is essential to a long-term, inclusive political settlement. President Ghani has made a bold proposal for peace talks, and now for a ceasefire. And NATO will continue to all we can to support Afghanistan on the path to peace and reconciliation. Elections in October will be an important milestone, and we encourage the Afghan government to continue reforms to maintain its fight against corruption and to uphold the human rights of all Afghans. We also stress the need for all countries in the region to play a constructive role. Over the last 2 days, NATO's defense ministers have paved the way towards the NATO summit next month, taking substantial decisions on deterrence and defense, on projecting stability and fighting terrorism, and on cooperation with the European Union. This meeting has shown NATO's unity, despite any differences over issues such as trade. We continue to stand united around our core task. So I think we once again show that despite disagreements on issues like trade or the Iran nuclear deal, NATO is able to stand united around our core task to protect and defend each other. And with that, I'm ready to take your questions.
We'll go to Reuters in the first row.
Thank you, Secretary General. You talked about the funding of the Afghan security forces until 2024. In Warsaw, the announcement was for $1 billion annually. Do you expect that similar funding level to remain? And when do you think you'll have a decision on that? Thank you.
The plan is to have a decision on that at the summit in July. And based on what I hear today, where many allies actually and partners announced new commitments, both for trainers and for funding, I'm very optimistic that the heads of state and government will decide to extend the funding to 2024. We haven't yet decided on the exact figures or numbers, but I think that to maintain the same level of support will be natural.
We go to the front row, 8 a.m.
This is from 8 a.m. Delhi, Kabul. Secretary General, you welcomed President Ghani's ceasefire, a long-week ceasefire with Taliban. During the ceasefire, if your forces or Afghan forces notice mobilization of Taliban around major cities of Afghanistan, that may lead to large attack of Taliban to these cities after ceasefire. Will you still advise our forces to stay in defensive mode? Thank you.
NATO's presence in Afghanistan is in a non-combat mission. We ended our combat mission back in 2015, and since then the Afghans has been in the lead. They have conducted the combat operations. We have supported them with training, with advice and assistance. President Ghani, and on behalf of the Afghan security forces and army, has declared that they will have a unilateral ceasefire, and we support his call on Taliban to join this ceasefire. What our troops will do is, of course, if they are attacked, to respond in self-defense, but NATO supports the ceasefire, and of course we support that the ceasefire is upheld and respected in the period it is announced.
We go to the second row, One TV.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary General. My question is regarding the interference of the regional countries and security situation of Afghanistan. Recently, the U.S. military commanders in Afghanistan expressed their serious concerns regarding the funding of Russia and Iran from the Taliban. Was this issue a topic that has been discussed, and is it a concerning thing for you too? Thank you.
It was discussed during the meeting today, the importance of having a regional approach, and that all countries in the region has to support the Afghan-led and Afghan-owned peace process. Therefore, I call on all countries in the region to support the Afghan government, the Afghan government's national unity, in their efforts for peace and reconciliation. And in that context, I think it is extremely encouraging to see the bold proposal by President Ghani to invite Taliban to peace talks without conditions, and at the same time also to announce the ceasefire. So now it's up to Taliban to show whether they really want peace. What we have stated from NATO is that our presence in Afghanistan is condition-based. So we will be there as long as needed, but of course the purpose of NATO's presence is to create the conditions for a peaceful solution, for reconciliation, which is Afghan-owned and Afghan-led, and therefore all the countries in the region should support that.
Okay. We'll go Salam Watanda.
Thank you. This is Nasser Maimaniki from Salam Watandar. NATO welcomed the week-long ceasefire announced by President Ghani. Don't you think 1 week is a little bit short, especially for the Taliban to come around for a response? And if the Afghan government extends the ceasefire, will NATO support that? Also, do you think the Afghan government should look into extension of the ceasefire? Thank you.
I think it's unprecedented to see an offer as President Ghani has made. First, to sit down with Taliban and negotiate, and then after that he followed up with the unilateral ceasefire, which was also a follow-up of the very clear decision by the religious leaders condemning violence and condemning suicide attacks. So I think that President Ghani has shown, both with the offer to peace talks, unconditioned peace talks, and also the ceasefire, that he is really committed to peace, and that he is bold in his way to approach peace and find a path to peace. Then it's up to Taliban, and they know that they have an opportunity now to seize the opportunity and to engage in real peace talks. There's a big difference between Afghanistan and, for instance, Venezuela. But I met the president, of Colombia. There's a big difference between Afghanistan and Colombia, and I recently met the president of Colombia, and he told me about the peace process there, where they actually were able to talk and fight at the same time, and where you also had a lot of, drug trafficking and income from illegal income from that. So I think actually it is possible to also look to other peace processes where it has been possible to overcome years of conflict and then reach a negotiated peaceful solution.
We'll go to NPR Deutsche Welle.
Thank you, Terry Schultz. Sorry, I wanted to go back to readiness. And you answered some of these questions in the previous press conference, but when it comes to mobility plus the new 430s, if the military mobility plans don't move very quickly, doesn't the 430s plan lose credibility because you could conceivably have 30 battalions, which is 30,000 military personnel needing to move at one time? I just want to know how both of, if you don't move really quickly by 2020, neither can those forces. And also, who's going to pay for this? You mentioned that some of the governments will have to pay themselves, some of it will come from EU funding. But the EU has also said that NATO should not expect that you give them instructions and they pay for it. So is there a consideration that perhaps allies could fold some of these upgrades, needed upgrades, into their defense spending to also help them on the 2%, 20% issues? Thanks.
So first of all, I'm absolutely certain that we will move quickly because that's exactly what NATO has done over the last years. We have implemented the biggest reinforcement of our collective defense since the end of the Cold War. We have tripled the size of the NATO response force as we announced and within the time limits we set. We decided to deploy 4 battle groups in the eastern part of the alliance. We were able to do that within the time limits we set, within a year. So what we have seen is that NATO is delivering, NATO is adapting, and with the speed and the agility which is needed when we need to adapt quickly as we are doing now. And therefore, I'm also absolutely certain that we will deliver now on the new promise to have 30 battalions, 30 battleships and 30 air squadrons ready within 30 days or less, and to have that in place by 2020. Then, of course, we also need infrastructure. And some of that will take time. But we have to remember that we don't start in Europe with zero infrastructure. We have roads, we have bridges, we have some airports. So this is part about upgrading infrastructure we already have, and also about building new infrastructure. And this is part of an ongoing modernization of the alliance. When it comes to funding, I think that, of course, for EU members, it's possible to get some funding from the European Union. And I welcome the action plan which the European Union has already put forward. For non-EU allies, of course, they don't expect money from the European Union for their roads and their bridges. But the thing is that we relate to our members, our allies, and they all have promised to also follow up when it comes to military mobility, invest in infrastructure, and I'm absolutely certain that they will be able to do so.
Okay, thank you very much. This concludes this press conference, and I can see Secretary Mattis is already waiting at the top of the stairs. Thank you.
Thank you.
And hybrid threats to the east. In response, we have discussed everything from burden sharing, an area where the alliance has made significant progress during the last year, I must note, to various other issues on our agenda. On the burden sharing, in 2014, it was a watershed year in NATO, when only 3 nations' military spending was at 2% of GDP, and generally we were on downward trends with our defense allocations in the democracies. By 2017, all nations had reversed the downward trend. 100% had reversed the downward trend by last year in defense spending, and last year we also saw the largest across NATO increase in military spending in a quarter century. Now, in 2018, 8 nations are already meeting the 2% pledge benchmark, and I salute the 15 allies who are on track to reach 2% by 2024. And Portugal, I think, just added to that, so actually we may be one higher. Many allies are making investments beyond the monetary aspect of the Wales Pledge, answering Secretary General Stoltenberg's call to provide, and I quote here, cash and capabilities and contributions, unquote. I appreciate the troops and the leadership these nations provide to support NATO's Kosovo, Afghanistan, forward presence, and other missions. With Secretary General Stoltenberg's capable leadership, we also continue to improve the speed of political decision-making. Coupled to building the NATO's military readiness, speed of alliance consultation and decision-making are a credible deterrent to any who would threaten our democracies. We engaged also our European Union partners on security cooperation. Specifically, we drilled down on military mobility. In our defense cooperation with the EU, NATO recognizes effective deterrence and defense depend on a transparent dialogue between us. We must demonstrate the political will among us to advance our security priorities. We also recognize that uncoordinated investments that waste resources or duplicate alliance efforts undercut our collective deterrence and defense posture. So we found further areas for cooperation and alignment of our two organizations. In the global fight against ISIS, we will continue to carry out operations necessary to crush the physical caliphate and prevent a resurgence of ISIS-Daesh. We will be unrelenting in our effort, working together with like-minded nations. We will target ISIS around the world, for this remains a global fight. To support these efforts, NATO is transitioning its current activity in Iraq into a sustainable training mission. In concert with the new Iraqi government, we will capitalize on Iraq's success and reinforce their long-term counterterrorism efforts. We cannot allow ISIS or any other terrorist group to terrorize the people of this region, again driving thousands of refugees from their homes and into Europe and elsewhere. On our resolute support mission in Afghanistan, NATO's steadfast commitment and the implementation of our South Asia strategy have renewed stabilization efforts, now including additional significant development funding from India. Recently, Qatar and the United Arab Emirates have joined our ranks, bringing our coalition to a combined 41 nations for resolute support mission in Afghanistan. I should also note that Afghan security forces continue to improve. All 6 Afghan corps are deployed throughout the country, demonstrating Afghan resolve, while the Afghan government pursues a stable and inclusive political order for its people with NATO's support. The level of confidence today is sufficient for President Ghani to announce a temporary ceasefire for the end of Ramadan, offering the Taliban an opportunity to bring to an end this fighting and providing the world a clear demonstration of his government and our alliance's commitment to peace and an Afghan-led, Afghan-owned peace process. In summary, for nearly 70 years, the NATO alliance has served to uphold the values and the principles on which our democracies were founded. The American people remain committed to this alliance, and we look forward to working together to sustain our core function, which is the collective defense of our people while fostering peace and security. So thank you, and may I take your questions?
So let's just keep our questions short given the earlier delay. But Terry?
Hi. Terry Schultz with Deutsche Welle and NPR. On the cooperation between the EU and NATO, you've now gotten your 430s plan endorsed by all the allies, but without real rapid advances in military mobility, which requires heavy investment by the EU, how credible is that plan, that you could actually move 30 battalions quickly across Europe with military mobility in the state that it is now? Do you trust that the EU will move fast enough on its infrastructure upgrades that are needed? Thanks very much.
We could move our forces across Europe right now today. You've all seen it done. You've seen certain peacetime constraints on them. Those probably would not exist in the event of a crisis. Obviously, many of these are basically national requirements, customs requirements, that sort of thing. So we can do it right now. We're talking about setting up a process by which we make this the norm rather than simply a response in a crisis situation. But the improved readiness of our forces is a real demonstration of political will. Fundamentally, it's a demonstration that we will stand with our fellow nations in the event they're threatened, and yes, it is credible.
Okay. Bob Burns, AP.
Mr. Secretary, Bob Burns, Associated Press. A question for you about President Ghani's ceasefire. Of course, it applies only to the Taliban. I'm wondering what you feel, is there room to intensify, how much room is there to intensify the American counterterrorism operations against ISIS-K, and how much of a threat do they still pose, ISIS-K?
Well, the NATO campaign is in protection of the Afghan people as we move toward a political solution. So you have, on the one hand, this very bold statement by President Ghani, reinforced by the Afghan security forces, that we're now in a position to continue the process that he started, Afghan-led, Afghan-owned, back in February, where he offered an open door to the Taliban. Their response was, of course, to kick off their fighting season in the months following. They have not made progress, and we're in a strong position. We support completely what he's doing, and obviously those forces that would have been otherwise engaging the Taliban, so long as the Taliban follow the offer of ceasefire, those forces are now in a stronger position to focus elsewhere. So there's a fair amount of capability then that would be available. But we'll have to see how this turns out. This is going forward with all the challenges that going forward on a peace process in the midst of a war like this brings. So we'll see how it works out, and we'll keep you posted.
You were saying that there are more resources available to go against ISIS-K, is that what you're saying?
Absolutely, there are. Just for example, should the Taliban take full advantage of the ceasefire in the best interests of the Afghan people, then many of the surveillance assets we have overhead could be reoriented to ISIS-K, to Al-Qaeda, and other foreign terrorists who have no business being in Afghanistan in the first place. Thank you.
Mustafa Sarwar.
Secretary Mattis, thank you very much. I'm Mustafa Sarwar from Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. You know that one of the major objectives of President Trump's South Asia strategy was to weaken the Taliban in Afghanistan, but some in Afghanistan argue that the strategy has not been able to turn the tide against the Taliban, as they have stepped up their attacks across the country. Are you in agreement, and what's your assessment of the strategy now?
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think that one of the ways you can determine the efficacy of the strategy is that we have had other nations join. We have had other nations increase the number of troops that they are committing. We have had other nations contribute significant amounts of development funds. So what you're seeing are objective indicators of a subjective analysis that the strategy is on the right track by numerous other nations there in the region, but even more so from Europe to elsewhere out into the Pacific. So this is not a narrow view of that. It's actually improving further. You noted, and I know what you're driving at here, you said they have kept up their attacks. In fact, they have been unable to keep up their attacks. The number of enemy-initiated attacks are down, which means more of the attacks are now initiated by the Afghan and NATO forces. That in itself is an indicator of the initiative is shifting to those who are initiating the attacks. Further, the actual number of attacks this year are down from past years. The real challenge that you face in your job of trying to understand this, and I faced in my job as well, is similar, and that is, how do you equate progress and violence going on at the same time? And it is a very challenging intellectual effort to try to get your hands around it. You have to look at who initiates the attacks. Sometimes violence can actually indicate you're getting closer to peace. We've all seen that near the end of other conflicts. But at the same time, I think the strategy stands up to any kind of scrutiny as going in the right direction. And that's indicated by events there on the battlefield and more broadly and right into the halls of Brussels here where we've met. Thank you, Mustafa.
Sylvie, AFP.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I have a question about Syria. How long are you ready to stay in Syria, given the fact that Assad said several times that he wants to control the whole country and that you could end up fighting the Syrian regime?
We are in Syria based on the conditions that are being set. As you know, a little over 100 hours ago, our partner forces kicked off in an offensive against one of the last remaining enclaves of the physical caliphate. So we are still engaged, ladies and gentlemen, in a fight against the ISIS-Daesh caliphate. It is not over yet, and that continues. So obviously, we are going to continue. The UN mandate being that Daesh is a threat, then we are going to continue to go after them. Further, we are not simply going to think, well, they're gone, so let's just walk away now. What you've got to do is support the local governing councils. You've got to support local security so you don't walk out and have them walk right back in. I mean, this only makes common sense. This is not a radically new thought. At the same time, the diplomats are working under Staffan de Mistura, the United Nations Special Envoy on Syria. They are working to re-energize the Geneva process, which is the way we're going to try to end this tragedy that's been going on ever since Assad declared war on his own people. So all of these factors have to be considered when you look at how long we will be there.
And are you ready to fight the Syrian regime?
We are there for under one circumstance right now, and that is to fight ISIS. We've made that very, very clear.
Thank you. Thank you all very, very much.
Let me just ask one question. This young lady came all the way from Iraq, and I met her. Really. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much. My question is: the U.S. Congress imposes sanctions on few Iraq militia groups belonging to Hashi al-Sha'bi. One of them is Asaib al-Ahl al-Haq, which won 15 seats in the Iraqi parliament in the last month's election. Now, how the U.S. will deal with this group in Iraq? How? Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, in the election, can you imagine 2014 with what was going on as Daesh, as ISIS was toppling cities in Iraq and taking over large parts of Iraq? Could you imagine in those times that we would be now discussing the outcome of an election in Iraq? And the Iraqi army has now removed the last of the physical caliphate there with great help from the coalition. And they were able to hold that election that came up, and all of us were watching it because we didn't know how it was going to turn out. Welcome to democracy. Perfect, imperfect, however you want to call it, welcome to a democracy in action. We will deal with the will of the Iraqi people. We will deal with those who come into the new government as it forms, and we will deal with them as a sovereign nation, and other nations, if they're not there at the invitation of the Iraqi people, the Iraqi government, they need to leave. We would only be there, we, the NATO mission, would only be there if invited by the Iraqi government. And so we'll have to give them some time to form the government, and then we will be able to determine our way ahead as an alliance. And I really have to go to a meeting now. I'd love to take a question from the Afghan press too, but I've got to go to a meeting now. Thanks very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you all very much.